Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 217. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm chatting with debut author and longtime playwright Ben Gonshor about his new novel, The Book of Izzy. In this book, we meet a gentleman named Izzy, who is at a dead end in his career, his love life, and his life in general. He is also experiencing a mental health crisis. But Izzy is given an opportunity to play the main character in the Dybbuk, a play that is considered Yiddish theater's Romeo and Juliet. This novel details Izzy's journey, from going off his meds, to experiencing the world of amateur dramatics, to ultimately discovering the impact that Yiddish theater has on his identity and his search for meaning in his life. The Book of Izzy blends dark humor with magical realism, while paying tribute to Yiddish culture. In this episode, I'll chat with Ben about his writing journey, how his success as a playwright led him to write his first novel, and what he describes as the miracle of writing, as well as a few other things. Coming up. Ben Gonshor, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Good to be here.
I thought what we could do today is start by talking about your debut novel, The Book of Izzy. If you don't mind, tell us a little bit about this book and what inspired you to write it.
Sure. So The Book of Izzy is about a guy named Izzy who has reached a dead end in his life professionally, creatively, romantically, and he's presented with an opportunity to take part in an amateur Yiddish theater production of the greatest play in all of Yiddish theater, Yiddish being a Jewish language. The play is called the Dybbuk. And when he gets involved with that, he sets off on a journey of discovery that really helps him rejuvenate all the elements of his life and to find purpose and meaning for the road ahead. I think your second question was what led me to write it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, back in 2015, I had just come off winning a playwriting award in New York, and we had done a reading of a play that I wrote. And I started thinking about what I wanted my next project to be. As I was thinking about what the idea would be, it started to become this really big thing. And it turned out that the project itself determined that it would be a novel. I didn't set out to say I want to write a novel. The scope of what I intended to write lent itself to that medium. I'd say one of the other things was that I had written screenplays and plays for years, and I was sort of tired of the process of needing a lot of stakeholders to get involved in order to get a project produced. And I knew that worst case scenario with a novel, if I couldn't find an agent or I couldn't find a publisher, I could always self-publish the material and put it out there into the world. That wasn't the goal, but I always knew that I could do that. The project would not sort of end up on the shelf. And so that was another reason why I ended up writing a novel.
Interesting. Okay. All right. Well, I want to talk about I want to talk about the book first. Then let's discuss what it was like writing a novel versus all the work you had done to date. But let's talk about the Book of Izzy first. In particular, I'd like to talk about some of the characters. So let's discuss Izzy first. What do readers need to know about Izzy going into the book?
Well, I think one of the main things about Izzy that people will discover is that he's going through a mental health crisis at the time that the story begins. And the journey that he goes on in the book is one it's a multifaceted journey. One journey is the choice he's made to go off his psychotropic medications and the journey that that entails. And the other journey is his journey of discovery, getting involved in Yiddish theater and seeing how that implicates his identity and how that allows him to find meaning and purpose in his life. So when readers open the book and enter the story, they're discovering Izzy on the cusp of some pretty important decisions in his life. And the reader is then taken on the journey with Izzy as he embarks on them.
Okay. So how did you I'm curious how you arrived at the starting point for the novel because it sounds like before the book even opens, Izzy has had a pretty interesting journey. How did you decide, okay, here's where the actual novel begins? Not necessarily Izzy's whole story, but what led you to decide to start there?
Yeah. Well, I think with any story, you start with some people call it a point of attack. Some people call it an inciting incident. Something happens just before your story starts, or just before the reader gets involved, that sets the journey off, right? So I created a series of inciting incidents, including Izzy's own mental health crisis, the the fact that his professional career is in crisis, his creative career is in crisis, and his romantic life is in crisis. All of these crises are happening at the same time that lead him to make a decision to set off on this journey. I think without those crises taking place, he would have no reason to set off on this journey, and therefore we'd have no story to tell.
Right, right. Did you at the time when you started writing, had you already detailed all those crises for him? Like what happens to him that leads to that point? Or did you just have a vague idea and then those details kind of were filled in later? How how did it end up working out?
My process is one whereby I don't write until I've got everything mapped out.
Mm,
That's just my process. Everyone's different. I cannot write from a blank page without knowing where I've been or where the characters have been, where the story has been, and where it's going. It's an insecurity of mine. Perhaps it's a little obsessive, but that is the process I need to follow. So I actually spent a good year, if not more, mapping out the whole story from beginning to end and knowing what was happening in the background before I even put pen to paper, so to speak.
how much changed from that original map that you spent a year creating?
Not much.
Really?
Yeah, no, really not much. Like I said, I spent a really long time mapping it out, mapping out the structure, the outline, going over my work with some trusted, friends and others to sort of bounce my ideas off to make sure I was headed in the right direction and wasn't going too far off track. I simply find that in order to propel myself forward in my writing, I need to know what my endpoint is. If I don't know my endpoint, I have a really hard time writing.
Mm. I know some writers like to be surprised or don't know the ending, but in your case, you always know your ending before you start.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I mean, I shouldn't say that. I think it really depends on the project. Sometimes you'll absolutely know the ending.
Hmm.
Sometimes you'll have a vague idea of where it needs to end, and hopefully it'll work itself out in the composition, in the writing. But typically, I like to know exactly where my end point is, what target I have to hit.
Yeah, yeah. Let's talk about maybe some of the other characters. I'm curious, are there maybe one or two other characters that come into Izzy's life in the book that may be helpful for readers to know about before they start?
I don't know if it's necessarily helpful for them to know about before they start. I think the process of discovery is one of the pleasures of opening up a book. But certainly when Izzy makes the decision to get involved in an amateur Yiddish theater production of the Dybbuk, the greatest play in Yiddish theater, it's the people that he encounters when he enters that world who really force him to reconsider some of his preconceived notions about his life and what he believes about life. It's that interaction that propels him constantly forward along his journey. So I hope that the readers, when they're with Izzy, when he gets into that world of the Yiddish theater, I hope that the readers will enjoy getting to know some of these characters that Izzy encounters.
Well, let's talk about one of the characters in the book, the actual play, the Dybbuk. For those who have not seen it, can you give us maybe a brief summary of it because it looms large in the story.
It does. The Dybbuk is sort of Yiddish theater's Romeo and Juliet. It is the love story of two individuals, a young man and a young woman, who encounter each other and fall for each other. What they don't know is that previously their parents, before these two were born, their fathers had known each other when they were studying in a Jewish seminary, and they made a pact with one another that should they get married, and should one of their wives bear a son and one bear a daughter, they will betroth them to one another. The audience learns this. Our two main characters do not know this. And invariably, these characters, they find each other in the play and they fall in love. And one of the fathers doesn't know who this young man is. And he betroths his daughter to somebody else. And the young man dies. But before he dies, he shouts out that he has won. And over the course of the rest of the play, what unravels is our understanding of what it means for him to have said he has won. And I won't give away how the play unfolds, but invariably, the two main characters, the two young lovers, do end up together, but it's not as you might think.
Okay. Let's talk about part of the setting for the book. I want to talk about the theater, the setting of the theater. As a playwright, that must have been fairly enjoyable for you to set this story in an atmosphere that you're very familiar with. But what was it about setting your story there that you had to, I don't know, pay particular attention to for the reader to really make it come alive? Were there things that you needed to focus on for the reader?
It's a good question. I have my part of my own personal history is an involvement in an amateur Yiddish theater company where I, in fact, played the lead role in multiple productions of the Dybbuk.
Hmm.
And I wanted to give the reader a flavor of what that experience was like. You know, part of the reason that I wrote the book was to say goodbye to a generation of individuals that are being lost to history, my grandparents' generation, who were native Yiddish speakers and who introduced me to the world of Yiddish theater. And as I was writing the book, I had already lost some of my grandparents who had passed away. And the last surviving one was getting getting older. And I I was I was struggling for a way to honor this generation of people who had had such an impact on my life. And so my setting the story or part of the story in the world of Yiddish theater was not just to give the readers something interesting to read about, because I do think it's interesting to experience the inside of what a theatrical production is like. But I wanted the reader to get a flavor of what Yiddish culture, in this particular case, Yiddish theater, is like. And as I said, it was also a way of my paying tribute to my grandparents' generation who had inculcated a love of this culture in me. And that's something that I wanted to share.
Well, let's talk about the difference between writing a novel and, say, writing a play or a screenplay, because your experience to date had been largely in the latter. I'm curious where you find the most freedom in your writing. Is it in the novel form or is it in one of these others?
Thank you for the question. If we're talking about the freedom, I would say it was in the novel.
Mm.
Uh, Novels do follow a certain structure, and plays certainly do as well. I would say the structure, there's more of a rigidity to play structure than there is in the novel. Again, this is my debut novel, so I don't speak from a whole lot of experience. But in comparing and contrasting the two, certainly with a play, you need to be cognizant of time. Your page count is very important when it comes to the idea of how long the play is. Of course, you have that in the novel as well, but I think there's a bit more runway there in terms of length and adhering to length a bit more. In playwriting, you also are writing for others who will, if you're lucky and you're going to have a play produced, you're also writing for others who you have to collaborate with, who are going to use the script that you've written as a Bible, so to speak, to work from. I'm talking about casting directors, the director, the designers of the play, to say nothing, of course, of the actors, but many other people are going to be using your play script for the work that they have to do than is the case with a novel. So they really do have some similarities, but some quite stark differences as well.
Yeah. Did your development of characters, did that change when you were writing the novel, or did you approach your characters the same way?
You mean once I had sketched them out, did they change as I was writing?
Yeah, or did you have to do more or less work for the novel than you might otherwise have for the play? Because in the play you're relying on someone else to bring it to life. Did that
Correct.
impact how you then had to develop the characters for the novel?
Right. Good question. I think as a writer, when you're starting from a blank page, be it a script for a play or long form, you still have to sketch out your characters in the same way. You need to have three-dimensional characters who are vibrant and who have a reason to act on things within the story, no matter what medium you're writing for. in the case of a place, and in the case of a script for a play, obviously the actors are reading the script and are looking at the characters who they're going to play, and the actors are going to bring something to it, but they're still looking to see who these characters are, whose lives these actors are going to inhabit. So the writer has no choice but to breathe as much three-dimensionality into these characters as possible before anybody else sees the manuscript. Characters tend to drive the action of a story. And if you don't have three-dimensional actors who have a reason to, three-dimensional characters who have a reason to act, you're really going to struggle to tell your story. So I spend a lot of time getting to know my characters before I ever write. I really need to have an understanding of who they are, where they're coming from, and why they have a reason to go somewhere before I write. Because if I know what their reason is to go somewhere, then I know that I can't go in a certain direction if it makes no sense for the character to go there. So I will spend a lot of time with my characters before I write.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what about the differences in the audience for the two types of stories? You just mentioned all the people you're writing for when you write a play, the people involved in the production, as well as the people sitting in the theater watching it. When you were writing the novel, who were you thinking about when you were writing it?
Thank you for the question again. When you're writing a script for a play, you always have to have that live audience in mind. So one of the things you need to be careful about when writing a play is, unlike a novel, for example, the key in writing a play is you want to show the audience what's going on as opposed to telling the audience what's happening. In a novel or in long form literature, you need to do a lot more describing because the audience is not physically in the same space, as the actors would be in a play, seeing what the actors are doing. So there's a lot more telling involved, a lot more describing, exposition, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So in my experience, exposition is something you want to avoid as much as possible in playwriting, whereas you don't have much of a choice in long form. You do have to describe for the reader the setting, the place, the time, all that kind of stuff, so that they have an idea of where they're at as you tell your story. I would say that's probably one of the biggest differences between the two mediums.
Yeah. Yeah. So other than fighting against that urge to not use a lot of exposition, what were the other, say, surprises that you found when you were writing this novel? Anything else shock you that you didn't realize before you started?
I don't know that anything shocked me. I do think the exposition piece was unfamiliar to me, and I struggled with that as I was writing drafts because I was not used to doing that, to describing a lot, which is something you have to do. And I felt very uncomfortable and very insecure in doing it. I hope I succeeded. I leave that to the reader's judgment. That I would say was the biggest hurdle for me to overcome. The other thing I would say is, and I'm always surprised by this, and it's a wonderful thing to be surprised by. Although I said previously that I tend to like to know where I'm going in the stories that I tell. One of the wonderful things that can happen to a writer as you're telling a story and your characters are fully fleshed out, you will find them saying things in dialogue that you didn't necessarily know was going to happen in advance. That's simply because the characters are alive in you and they're telling you what it is they want to say. I always find that an amazing thing when I enter a scene between at least two characters and they start talking to each other. The miracle of writing to me is that I, as the author, don't so much tell the characters what to say as much as let them speak through me. And I am so grateful for that experience, to have had that experience in all of my writing, but particularly in the book. I never imagined Izzy would be as colorful a character as he became. I knew who I wanted him to be, but at the end of the day, he told me who he wanted to be and spoke through me. And that is just a real privilege as a writer to have happened to you.
Yeah. Well, now that it's happened to you once, do you have plans for more novels? Is this something you think you will continue to do?
I'm not sure. I'm definitely going to continue writing because it's what I do. Again, one of the wonderful things with Izzy and his world is that even though I wrote the end at the conclusion of the novel, I don't believe that we've heard the last of Izzy and the people that are in his world. I feel like there are more adventures ahead for them. I don't know what the next adventure is,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know when I'm going to write it. But when I finished, I knew it wasn't over. So that's pretty exciting.
Yeah.
Writing
Yeah.
a novel is quite an undertaking.
Mm.
And so it's a commitment unlike any other I've ever made. And so before I do it again, I want to know that I'm really all in. And right now I'm just taking in the experience of having launched my debut novel, which
Yeah.
is it's very meaningful and very humbling.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, if people want to learn more about you and the book and things that you have going on, where can they go to find you and that information?
They can find me on my website at bengonshor.com.
Good. And if they're looking to purchase a copy of the Book of Izzy, where can they go to buy it?
Well, it's available online in multiple places. I would say certainly Amazon, Barnes and Noble are two popular places to buy books. So as far as I know, the book is available in those two venues and many others as well.
Wonderful. Well, Ben, thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast. I want to wish you luck with the Book of Izzy, as well as your other projects, and fingers crossed for more adventures of Izzy in the future. So congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far, and best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity.
The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the Bookshop at the End of the Internet.